So far, we've looked at this notion of the magic trick that has three parts: the pledge, the turn, and the prestige. And I've looked at how, at an existential level, all of us have a type of object in our lives that causes us suffering. It promises us wholeness and completeness, but it delivers only anxiety and struggle. And we're talking about how do we make this object disappear in our lives. Well, now I want to look at the turn. I want to look at how we can begin to understand a way of finding freedom from this sacred object, making it not exist. Now, technically it doesn't exist, but it insists in our lives. So we want to take away that insistence that it has. And to understand how we do that, I want to take four theological concepts. I want to strip them of their more contemporary religious meaning and try to drill down to their essential definitions to see if it can help us understand what it might look like to live free from the sacred object. So the first concept I want to look at is the concept of original sin. Original sin, very simply, can be understood to mean an originary lack that we feel in the core of our being. Now, this is something that ultimately starts when we enter the world as subjects. There's basically two kinds of birth. There's the physical birth, and then there is the birth of subjectivity that happens a few months later. And subjectivity is inherently intertwined with feeling separate from the primary caregiver. We only start to get a sense of ourself when we see ourselves as not the other. And so the infant gradually comes to terms with the fact that they are not their parents, they are not their siblings, they are not the world. They can only have an I when there is a non-I. There is only a self when there is another. And this then represents their birth into the world as an individual. But this birth can be traumatic because there's a sense of having lost something. We are marked forevermore by something that is missing. Sin then is any activity we do in order to try to fill that lack in our lives. Anything we do to try to reestablish a harmony and a wholeness that we feel we've lost. Thirdly, we come to forgiveness. Now, forgiveness simply refers to the experience in which you are cut off from the need to pursue that sacred object. Now, to understand this, we can return to the concept of debt. When you have a debt, there's basically two things you can do. You can pay the debt, or the debt can be forgiven. Now, to pay a debt means that you or somebody else puts the money into that hole. If you owe $1,000, you or somebody else pays that $1,000. But to forgive a debt means that someone says the nothingness that is something is nothing. In other words, forgiveness of a debt is the rendering of the nothingness that is something into the nothingness that is nothing at all. So, for example, in the Jewish tradition, the year of Jubilee was a time when debts were not paid, but were forgiven. The nothingness that bound everybody together, that created so much strife, was forgiven. The nothingness was rendered nothing. And so finally we come to the word grace. Grace is the term for living in this experience of freedom from the pursuit. It is the experience of being, of realizing that I'm not okay, you're not okay, and that's okay. That we don't have to do anything. Before we looked at the serpent as the one who is always telling us that we have to do something, and we think that we need to obey the serpentine voice. This is technically Satanism. Satanism not being to do with worshipping some evil entity, but rather frenetically pursuing some type of wholeness. Grace is the exorcism of that voice. It is the freedom to simply be. Now, the first question that arises with regards to grace is why anybody would change for the better if they feel themselves accepted for who they are. If we don't need to strive, then why would we do anything at all? But grace is a paradoxical technology. In finding yourself able to accept yourself, you also find that you're more able to change. And the more you try to change, the less you can. So take an example of this woman who was having lots of casual relationships and lots of one-night stands, and she felt deeply guilty about it. And she went into psychoanalysis and she talked to her therapist about it. And she said to the therapist that at least she feels guilty. Because if she didn't feel guilty, she'd probably be sleeping with more people and having more casual relationships. But as the analyst helped her work through her guilt, and as her guilt began to diminish, so did her desire to have these casual relationships. So initially, the guilt seemed to be the thing that was preventing her from doing more of this activity, but it was actually the very thing that was generating the activity. Or take the example of AA. In AA, there are 12 steps for how to change, but before those steps become effective, you have to experience step 0. And so what's step 0? I mean, simply, you walk into the room, you take a seat in the circle, you say your name, you admit that you're an alcoholic, something that you might have denied for many years, and you do that in a room of people who nod and accept you for who you are and who don't ask anything from you. Paul Tillich defines grace as the acceptance that you're accepted. You might sit in that circle for a week or for a month or for a year before you can actually feel that acceptance go through your body. But when you truly feel the acceptance that you're accepted, then real change can happen. So the irony is, the more you lower the prohibition and the more you experience love, the more you're not asked to change, well, the more you can. Now, I want to put this into a theological and biblical language. We started by looking at Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden to begin to understand what the sacred object was. And now I want to look at Christ and the crucifixion. In many ways, Christ and the crucifixion is simply a retelling of the same story we see in Adam and Eve. There were 3 parts to the garden. The part where Adam and Eve freely could walk around, the part where the fruit tree was, and the prohibition that held them apart. In the same way, the Temple of Jerusalem had 3 parts. There was the court of Gentiles, where people could come and freely engage with each other. There was the Holy of Holies, and between them there was a massive curtain that no one could pass except for the priest on certain days. This, by the way, is not unlike a magician's stage, where you have the audience, and then you have the magician with a curtain, and behind the curtain, you have the object that they are going to make disappear. And sure enough, in this story, Christ cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And at that moment, the temple curtain rips, just like a magician's curtain, and we see inside the Holy of Holies, and we discover that nothing is there, that the sacred object doesn't exist, that the thing that would make us whole and complete is not there, is not something that we can grasp, touch, or see. It is not something that exists within space and time. This is the nihilistic core of conversion. It is the moment at which we are freed from this pursuit of some object of completeness. Now the question is, why does the curtain rip at this moment when Christ cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Why is this the hocus pocus of the magic trick? Well, very simply, you can take this phrase as a theological way of saying that reality itself contains lack, that the absolute is not at one with itself. Now, this is an insight that we see in a variety of fields today. In biology, it's called evolution. Evolution is simply the name for a type of antagonism within biological entities that mean that they are not one with their environment and not one with themselves. And this antagonism is what generates the incredible complexity and beauty that we see in the world of animals. In politics, it's called democracy. Democracy is simply the name that is given to the fact that our social reality is not at one with itself, that our social reality contains many competing notions of the good, and all of these competing interests are brought together in a way that can serve us all. In the realm of mathematics, this is called incompleteness. The mathematician Gödel discovered that when a mathematical system attempts to be completely complete and all-encompassing, one discovers that there is an incompleteness built into it, that the entire mathematical edifice has a type of not at oneness with itself. Within physics, this is called indeterminacy. Indeterminacy is used in quantum mechanics to describe how reality itself is not at one with itself, how reality itself has a type of deadlock interwoven into it. And this is what gives rise to wave-particle duality and superpositioning. In psychoanalysis, it was discovered that the subject is not at one with itself, that we have competing desires and interests. And this non-at-oneness is called the unconscious. Or in philosophy, it's given the name absolute knowledge. This is the point when philosophy discovers that there is a type of contradiction at the heart of reality and thought. And theologically speaking, this is called conversion. It is the moment when you realize and you participate in the not at oneness of the absolute. This actually connects with something that happens in childhood. There are two elements of childhood called alienation and separation. Alienation is the moment when you discover that you are not at one with your parents, that there is a type of distance between you and them. And the child wants to close that distance as much as they can. But as the child grows, they discover that they are not simply alienated from their parents. Their parents are alienated from themselves. And this is called separation. Separation is the realization that your parents are conflictual, that they cannot be fully satisfied, that they are not at one. And when we discover that, we become more comfortable with our own incompleteness. The thing we share with our parents is the fact that neither of us are complete. In the same way in religion, the first act is where we want to return to the ground of our being. We want to experience oceanic oneness. We want to be one with the absolute. And that is only overcome when we identify with Christ, when we identify with the crucifixion, and we realize that the absolute is not at one with itself. Then we are freed from the sacred object, because we realize there is no way to find that harmony. There is no way to find that completeness, because incompleteness is gloriously interwoven into reality itself. And that frees us from this terrifying, destructive pursuit of the thing that will fix everything.